All right, and now I'm with Alex Schumacher, a comic book creator. Now, Alex, you are a writer and artist. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Excellent. Two your comic book strips that I've been reading is Decades of Inexperience and Mr. Butterchips. And I just got to say, man, those are excellent pieces of work.
Well, thanks. I appreciate that. Yeah, those are my two main ongoing works right now. So any kind feedback like that is appreciated.
Yeah. Can you do us a favor and kind of break down a little bit of what each of these projects are about?
Yeah, absolutely. So Decades of Inexperience sort of started out as illustrated flash fiction. It was in a period where I had these delusions of grandeur where I was going to be a prose author. And so I was just kind of getting back into illustrating as well. And the first couple of years, because of that, are more like illustrated flash fiction. But then I gravitated more and more back towards comics, as I always have. And so starting with the third year, it was just an outright comic strip or a weekly web comic. And the
Right.
basis behind it is just it's semi-autobiographical. It's sort of catharsis for me to write about things that have happened to me. But as I've gone along, we're now in the fourth year. And I've realized it's also kind of a way to hold myself accountable because it talks about some kind of unsavory things, untowards things that I've done and people have done, and things like addiction and I don't know, misogyny, and even if it's casual and you don't realize you're doing it, things like that. So I've realized that it's a way to hold myself accountable, which has been really interesting to sort of analyze it in that way. And I meant for it from the beginning, I wanted it to be a character growth piece. So he starts out as sort of this, people said a lot of, in the beginning, people compared it to like Charles Bukowski. And I suppose in a way it was very much like that character. But unlike Charles Bukowski, I knew Luke was going to grow and learn and hopefully progress towards a better version of himself, which I think he has. And
Yeah.
so it's sort of that idea of a long-term growth of a character. And then so Mr. Butterchips started out as an homage to underground comics, and that was essentially the only idea I had for it. Something along the lines of Fritz the Cat, or one of those 60s or 70s underground strips. And then the election of 2016 happened, and I took a hard left into sort of political and social commentary. It just ended up being the perfect sort of vessel for that. So the majority of the last 3 years have been either editorial or commentary with the monkey.
Yeah. Both of them are feeding into our social narrative that we have going on right now, which has been pretty complex and sometimes frustrating for all of us. And the way that Decades of Inexperience plays out, you're rooting for this character, and he's got, of course he has his falls and stuff like that. I was just reading the current ones where, he's having to move back in with the folks and stuff like that. And we've all experienced those moments where we're like, will I succeed past this? We don't know. So we're living life with him. And then with Mr. Butterchips, the way you talk about it used to be in underground comics, it's totally that. And now it's almost like your raunchy older cousin kind of telling you, like yelling at you, like, this is how the world works. And you're like, yeah, no, duh, it does. Well, I'm not thinking this way.
Right.
So it's been a lot of fun. It's just enjoying both of these.
Your lawn and at the same time giving them some life advice, hopefully, as well.
Yes. Yeah, it's pretty great. I like those moments where with Mr. Butterchips, like he's yelling the truth at you, and then at the end is like, keep it up, kid. It's like, okay, sure.
Right.
It's great.
It's the sort of angry lecture with the big hug at the end. Hopefully a little bit more, of a comfort at the end. But yeah, it's been a great vessel for me, like I said, because if I was trying to do that with Decades of Inexperience or something else that had a human character, I always feel like that may not be received as well because nobody really wants to hear about those things, especially when they're trying to be entertained. And I completely understand that. But when you're doing it through the guise of a crotchety old monkey, I think it's still entertaining and enjoyable enough that the message can still be received without it being too invasive.
Yeah, and I think it's funny because I'm thinking also back to the paneling and how both of them interact with their paneling and the page layouts and stuff like that, which we'll get into later on. But even the human aspect versus how Mr. Butterchips works within the comic book page is quite a bit different, and only Mr. Butterchips could do what he does. So it really works out pretty great.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. I was in the beginning when I was getting back into illustrating, sort of in the early aughts, as they say, 2005 to about 2012, 2013, I imagined myself to be the next great comic book illustrator, which was absolutely a weird aspiration. But what I was doing was being very quote unquote creative and fancy. The problem with that is it ends up muddling the storytelling and can convolute things that you're trying to tell with the picture. So with Decades and Mr. Butterchips, it's a little bit more of straightforward paneling, but the angles are switched up, and things are different enough, varied enough that I think it's still
Yeah.
decent to look at.
Yeah. All right, so let's talk a little bit about yourself, and then we'll go ahead and follow up with your comic books. What kind of inspirations or ideas inspired your current projects? Where did you come up with the idea for Decades or for Mr. Butterchips?
Decades of experience again was just I was reading a lot of either thinly veiled memoir or autobio stuff, and there was a lot of
Okay.
comics that were coming out at the time that were exploring those specific categories and genres. And
Hmm.
I had for a long time tried to insert myself into more of a fantasy or supernatural realm because I loved things like Mike Mignola's Hellboy and fancied myself
Right.
like a dime store Mike Mignola. Uh,
Hmm.
but the truth was, the stories that I wanted to tell were more based in humanity and just the human condition and things that we all go through. And I know that sounds very vague or maybe pretentious in a way, but those were the things that interested me were more about
Right.
people and what we all go through. So Decades was certainly a way for me to express that, and not even with the intention of necessarily relating to people, but I think things that we all experience are relatable regardless, whether it's to 5 people or 5 million people. So again, it was a way for me to sort of exercise some demons and hold myself accountable in ways that I didn't otherwise. And again, that sort of morphed into that from the initial idea, but it's been a really rewarding thing for me to do. And Mr. Butterchips was just something fun to do where I could talk about drugs and sex and things like that
Yeah.
indiscriminately. But again, that took a hard left as well, which has been a good stress relief to some degree. And,
Hmm.
it's good for my anger management to have an outlet like that where you can sort of scream at the audience, and if people want to join in, that's great. And so that was more of where Mr. Butterchips came from. It wasn't even necessarily that prefabricated. Aside from the whole underground comics thing, it just really organically morphed into the um, social and political commentary zone that it inhabits now.
Yeah, and even when you're reading these two, Decades kind of reminds you of like journal entries. So
Yeah,
you're almost like a very soft version of maybe, or not even soft, you know what I mean, but a sitcom. If you're thinking of the old Jerry Seinfelds, where he'd opens up with him on the stage, and then you kind of see that play out.
right.
So you're getting almost a day in the life and the struggles of an average 34-year-old, which is me right now. So it's kind of
Yeah.
like, okay, that makes sense. And then those parts that get pent up in you, where you just want to yell in the world and just make things right, or just the extremes of your personality. There's your Mr. Butterchip. So it really works out well. It's kind of like the ego, the id, all that, all wrapped up into these two comics. Is pretty great.
Yeah, it's pretty good balance between the two. It's
Yes, yes.
one I can just kind of focus on my experiences, and of course, a lot of it is played up for effect. But then to go with Mr. Butterchips and just be able to sort of shout my opinions from the rooftops and run it up the flagpole and see who salutes.
Yeah. Okay, now you had these ideas and you decided you want to make them. Where did you start off? Like, what was your process into like, okay, I need to make these a reality from my ideas? Did you go right into web comics? Did you want to try to do print? What was your options?
Initially, I was trying to get into the print game, so I was working with other writers, and we were pitching to places like Image and Dark Horse and places of that nature, and never really got anywhere. And so when I sort of came back to comics, the web comics thing was beginning to get a little bit bigger. There was a small
Hmm.
phase sort of in the early 2000s and late 90s, I think, where web comics were a big thing, and that sort of fizzled out. But then, like you said, the sort of diary or journal comics idea came back about. And I had been introduced to a guy named Francis Lombard, who is the publisher or the editor in chief at Antics Press. And we were connected through a mutual connection in the industry and ended up hitting it off and had this idea and just kind of ran with it. And Francis had a lot of experience in the industry. He'd worked for Humanoids and several other publication houses like that. So that was so, and I always feel for myself, I'm terrible at marketing and promotion. So I always try to, partner with a publisher or somebody who's more adept at that side of the industry. And so Francis has been good for me in that way. And then with Mr. Butterchips, I had written a story actually for Drunk Monkeys. They're the literary magazine that publishes Mr. Butterchips. And so I just kind of wanted to do it as a goof almost initially. I don't even know that I planned on it being a serialized comic strip, or sort of episodic, I guess. It's not really serialized. And so I just brought it to the editor at the time, and he was all for it and sort of gave me creative carte blanche to go and create and have a good time.
Yeah, you could see that you have so much more freedom on the Butterchips one because, yeah, again, like it is to the extremes and stuff like that. And it's great that they decided to back you and give you the freedom, which is hard to find nowadays in the creative world.
And with Mr. Butterchips, it's the idea that it is sort of cartoony and I can be wacky and outlandish with it. Whereas with Decades, it's something that's a little bit more personal. And so it's the attempt to, I don't know, like we were talking about a little bit before, it's the attempt to have a poignant or powerful message in 6 panels.
Right.
And there's still a lot of sort of surreal imagery that's mixed in because I think that keeps it interesting. But yeah, with Mr. Butterchips, that's definitely a far more wacky piece of work.
Yeah. Yeah, moving into the actual comics themselves, Mr. Butterchips, he is that wacky character. He actually reminds me a little bit of the Animaniacs. Do you remember the Animaniacs from the 90s?
Yeah, absolutely. I love the
Yeah.
probably some sort of subconscious influence there.
Yeah, it feels kind of in that sense where like Animaniacs exist in this WB world, but they're breaking all the rules and they're shining a mirror back on on Warner Brothers themselves. And so you kind of have that with Mr. Butterchips too, where he's breaking all the rules. But yeah, it's a lot of fun.
Yeah, and I'm sure a lot of those, influences from when I was a kid, I think any creator sort of absorbs those influences and maybe doesn't even realize they're coming out until somebody that you're talking to says, hey, that's kind of like the Animaniacs, and a light bulb.
Yeah.
You go, oh yeah, I did love that too. So I'm sure there's a little bit of that.
That's great. That's a great thing.
Yeah, no, it's because you put this work out into the world and you have a specific intent or a specific goal or a specific thing that you're trying to convey, but everybody receives it and interprets it differently. And I think that's one of the most interesting aspects of storytelling. And so it's really fun and interesting to me to hear different people's takes on the comics.
Right. Yeah. And then with Decades, you have a protagonist that's again it's the daily slice of life and stuff like that. And I wanted to kind of compare their paneling now.
Sure.
So with Decades, as you're going through the stories, I like how you have like these metaphors at each different panel,
Mm-hmm.
and so you kind of feel like, oh, this moment there's we're just talking about the one where he's trying to escape, or the one where his roommate is going to be leaving, and so you have that he's in a castle now and he has safety, and so you kind of feel like you're inside of his psyche, you're inside of his mind, living this with him. And then you're also seeing the panels where he's trying to convey the reality to his friends or the mask he's putting on.
Yeah, and that's sort of the idea is it's supposed to be sort of a cross section of his brain in a way where you're seeing sort of how he envisions things or what his thought process is about it. But then you're seeing what's actually happening in the real world too. And some of that's actually taken from one of my early mentors, a guy named Michael Jancy, who did a comic strip called The Norm. Oh, he actually still does it, but it was syndicated in newspapers for a long time. And so he did a lot of that kind of stuff too, sort of the surreal characters, like I Have Drunk Death and the, grumpy goblins and things that embody specific attitudes or emotions from Luke. And Michael Jancy did that a lot with his character, the Norm, as well. So that certainly rubbed off on me. And I, took it in my own direction. But he was definitely a big influence on the Decades of Inexperience narrative, for sure.
Yeah. And then with Mr. Butterchips, you kind of, again, we've talked about how he breaks the rules and stuff like that. While you compare these two together, I like how you keep these metaphors and he's still in these semi-tight boxes. They do break them. Like there are moments where they break them, but then in Mr. Butterchips, it's like all coming at you. There's so much more detail in every little panel too, because it's just you're almost overloaded with how much is coming at you. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and I think that's a fair observation. And again, I think a lot of that came from Mr. Butterchips was kind of supposed to look more like a Gilbert Shelton who did the Fabulous Furry Freak Brothers, and
Right. Yeah.
it was more geared towards that. So I think just naturally, I ended up sort of filling the panels from border to border with Mr. Butterchips, whereas with Decades, I think the main thing is the storytelling. So again, I try not to muddle that too much. But the artwork for Mr. Butterchips is definitely a bit more unfettered, I think.
Yeah. It's hard to explain, but that's exactly right. When you said it fills it from border to border, that's exactly right. Where with Decades, you're almost filling in that environment because you're living in that environment more.
Yeah, and there's a lot of narrative. You're sort of taking in both the narrative and the imagery with Decades, whereas with Mr. Butterchips, a lot of it is in the imagery. And so there's a lot of sort of jokes in the background and little things that, maybe can be considered an Easter egg.
Mm-hmm.
So there's a lot more of that in Mr. Butterchips for sure.
Oh yeah, I'm thinking of a couple that I won't spoil for the fans. They have to go out and read them, but there's some really good Easter eggs.
Yeah,
in Butterchips for sure.
right.
One of my favorite ones. So for the earlier works in Decades, it was written much more like a journal where you actually had this long form discussion going back and forth, which quite often turned into poetry essentially, and with just 2 or 3 illustrated moments. The one I have actually up right now, it's just so mind-boggling how great it is where you have the heart sitting on top of a comic strip and a pencil stabbed into it.
Right, with the Jack Kirby quote.
The Jack Kirby quote. You said you took it right out of it. It was so wonderful. For anybody who's a real comic book fan, Jack Kirby is like the godfather of comics. He's he's amazing.
Yeah.
And what was your decision in switching forms? Why did you want to go from this form into the paneled form that you use now?
Because I think I realized where my talents, for lack of a better word, were better utilized was in the combination of imagery and narration, which was comics. Whereas before it was just, like I said, illustrated flash fiction. And there's nothing wrong with that. I just feel as though I was always leaning back towards comics because I love comics. They're my first love as far as storytelling goes. And I was, for some reason, being obstinate and resistant about going back to it because there was some idiotic voice in my head saying that wasn't real writing or whatever it was that was completely ridiculous. And then I just acquiesced and admitted that, of course, it's real storytelling. And that was a stupid obstacle to put in my own way. So I just dove headfirst right back into comics and haven't looked back.
I really I like both of these, of course. I mean, everything you've done so far, totally a fan of.
Thanks, man.
But I'm wondering, do you have any intentions of going back to this form, the Flash form before, like you used before?
No, I've thought about actually maybe if and when I get established a little more, maybe doing a prose book or just an all narrative book, about comics, or maybe from a history standpoint or something along those lines. But as far as the comics properties goes or the story properties goes, I think comics are my wheelhouse that I'm going to be pretty firmly planted in.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Everything's turning out great so far. Thanks. I mean, you've got a fan here, so there's no reason to change. It was just, I really liked, both of them are great, but in their different ways as well. With the old format, you actually had like so much more to say. And like I had said before, it turned into poetry most of the time.
Yeah. That was sort of finding my voice too. I mean, that was one of the good things about, doing the longer text blocks was really kind of finding my voice and teaching myself how to write, because that was always one thing that I didn't necessarily focus on. I was just trying to be the best illustrator that I can be. So when I realized I just wanted to tell my own stories, I needed to start drilling that, like a basketball
Yeah.
player or an athlete of some sort. They take the weekend of their game and they have to drill it and they have to practice it to strengthen in that arena. So for me, that was writing. And I
Yeah.
think that was also, an impetus behind doing the first couple of years as they were, was just to kind of, get my feet wet and hone that side of the craft, which I think has served well in going back to comics, because I've become much better at self-editing in the sense of knowing what to leave out and what to use.
And that's such a vital part that many people who start off in trying to create products or create projects in any kind of medium, self-editing is the hardest thing to do. As a podcaster, for sure, it's one of those things.
And part of that is you have to be careful too, because sometimes you can tell yourself to leave something out that's really great. So it's really learning that, where the lines are, and also having an editor for me is pretty vital. So that's why I've partnered with people like Ant Express or Drunk Monkeys, because having that beta reader or that sounding board has just been integral for me in my own growth as a storyteller, which just hopefully continues in that direction.
Yes, yes, yes. What are your big plans? Like, if you could just wish to a genie, what are the big plans right here for Mr. Butterchips and decades of inexperience?
Well, both, and you heard it here first, folks. Both there are planned collections for both, which I'll hopefully be able to
Awesome.
talk a little bit more about maybe later in the year or early next year. But Ant
Okay.
Express and Mr. Butterchips, or Decades of Inexperience and Mr. Butterchips, rather, there are collections in the works. So hopefully I'll be able to announce a little bit more with a little bit more detail pretty soon. But definitely that,
Excellent.
because people, the small fan base that we've acquired, which has been great, have all asked that. They're great on the web, but when is there going to be a book? We'd love to see a collection. So I think where it's finally lighting that proverbial fire under our ass to put those together.
Be sure to tag us in. Whenever you announce those, we're going to be pushing that like crazy. We're super excited for those over here.
Oh man, that's appreciated, and yeah, I absolutely will.
So we have your two major flagship comic books here, and you have future plans for other stories. And currently, you're working with a literary agent. Can you break down what a literary agent is for us?
Sure. A literary agent is sort of a combination of a manager and a salesman for your work. So it's absolutely integral and necessary when you're pitching to the bigger publishing houses like Random House or Penguin, or the big five. I think is the number. It's the big five publishers.
Mm-hmm.
You can't even get in the door without an agent these days. So for a long time, agents were not representing graphic novelists or author illustrators, because here in North America, I think a lot of the book publishers hadn't quite picked up on the fact that graphic novels are great pieces of literature just as much as any other kind of writing. And places like Europe and Japan and places that have adopted a very American art form of comics have all grown to love and respect that art form just as much as any other storytelling platform. So now I think North America is finally starting to recognize that as well. So all of the big publishers started having imprints for graphic novels. And the way to get to those editors is you can't just send them to the publisher. You need to have that, sort of gatekeeper, for lack of a better word, to filter the wheat from the chaff, I guess. So
Yeah.
I kind of had to learn trial by fire how to query agents, and was lucky enough to find mine, who's wonderful. And we are in the process of pitching a graphic novel of mine right now. So fingers crossed.
That'd be great. Yeah. So when you're pitching to these through a literary agent, are you showing them the potential of future prints, or are you just trying to pitch the one graphic novel, maybe a mini series, something like that? Like, how are you trying to sell yourself? Are you trying to sell future earnings, or like, this is the great product you guys are gonna get right now?
Yeah, I think the idea is to present something that they feel will have some longevity.
Okay.
It's not necessarily that you're gunning for that initially, but of course, I mean, publishing is a business, so they're going to want something that's going to make some money, or they at least hope will make some money. So you're presenting for what I'm doing now with my agent. We have a finished manuscript and about a chapter of artwork that we're showing around, which will hopefully give the impression of what the book can and will look like. So I know, but with graphic novels, again, it's such a burgeoning sort of category in publishing that I've also heard there are literary agents that have sold books on a synopsis or on a premise with some character designs. So it
Oh
really,
my goodness.
yeah, it's really all across the board. And I'm sure with some of those sales that happened with a little bit less material to show, those were some names that were a little bit more established. But it can happen, and that's the beautiful part about graphic novels is you have those two entities of art and narrative working together, and they have to work together because if you're just illustrating what you're writing, then just write prose, because there has to be something different that you're presenting with the artwork. It can't just be what you're writing because there's no real point in doing that.
Right. That's what I was wondering is if it's something if we're looking at the movie standpoint. So Todd Phillips, the director for the new Joker movie that just came out,
Mhm.
he presented, "Oh, I want to do the entire DC Dark universe." And they're like, "Hold on. You got to make one movie at a time."
Right.
And so I was wondering if that's how the publishers work. Like, let's see what you could come up with first, and then after we trust you, does your literary agent return back to the publisher and renegotiate a longer contract, or do they kind of get you under contract for a set amount and that's it? How does that work exactly?
I think it depends on the contract. I know that my agent has sold two book deals for people, and not necessarily the same series, just two books that had a pitch that were ready to go. So he
Okay.
sold them, a two-book contract. With ours, we're just selling one right now, but there's also people have intended series. So maybe have that first book done and then ideas for the next few in that series or however many that you plan to do. And I think it's all very individual in that sense, where it's essentially whatever you're pitching, they'll look at. So your agent, if any agent worth their salt, will know how to navigate that. And hey, here is this one graphic novel, this one standalone graphic novel that we're pitching. Do you like it? Or this is the first in a line of 6 intended to be a series. Is this something you're interested in? So I think it varies greatly just between artist and project. But what we're doing right now is just a standalone. And hopefully, I think the idea is you then are able to establish a good working relationship with a publisher and an editor. And so maybe when you have your next book, you go, hey, are you interested in this? And a lot of the times those contracts even include clauses where they have first rights to see any new projects.
That would make sense. That's sort of the old school Hollywood thing was they would get you under the house first, and then you'd have to almost break the contract with the house, or they would have to turn away your projects before you can shop anywhere else.
Yeah, and I feel like publishing is very similar in that regard. And I'm sure it's a matter of if you're making them money, why wouldn't they want your next book?
Exactly. Being productive and cost efficient. That's all that they care about.
Yeah, and that's the thing is I think a lot of people get discouraged when they're either pitching to literary agents or even pitching publishers in the direct market and they get rejections. Everybody gets rejections, and you're going to collect a lot of rejections. That's just part of this industry. And I think a lot of people get discouraged because they take those rejections as some sort of statement on their worth as their talent, or some sort of rejection of them as a creative person, where it's not. It's very, number one, the industry is very subjective, and number two, they have to have something that they can sell. So even if they love
Exactly.
it, they could love it, absolutely be head over heels gaga in love with this project that you have. But if they don't think they can sell it, they're not going to take it. So
Right.
it's just something that I think you learn, along the way, that a rejection is not necessarily a repudiation of you as an artist. It's just not something that they think they can sell at that time. And markets change and editors switch positions. So anything's possible. You can always, books have sold 3 years after they've been rejected or 10 years after they've been rejected. Or you hear things about, like J.K. Rowling and Harry Potter, and she was rejected by everybody 5 times and then suddenly found an editor who gave it a chance. So this is an industry of perseverance and maybe, dogged persistence and a little bit of pigheadedness. But if you want to do this, then I think you're going to do it regardless.
You're basically going through both versions of what sounds like the comic creator's, journey, the career style. Which would do you prefer? Going it alone and trying to do these indie comics like you have with Decades and Mr. Butterchips, or this industry style where you're sitting there with an agent and really trying to push getting into the big names?
Each has their benefits because, the indie stuff, of course, you have more control over and
Mm-hmm.
you can kind of do whatever you want, which is always a goal. And whereas you're working with a larger entity or establishment that may ask you to change things because they need to be able to sell it or, direct it towards a specific market. So I think there's advantages to both because with the bigger trade publishers, you're going to get a lot more exposure and a much wider audience. But
Right.
the indie, the webcomic stuff, you are just far more in control and can say, could cover the topics and the things that you want to without having to worry about those being sanitized or, watered down.
Okay. Okay. All right. Well, I think that's going to be it for us. How could everybody reach you if they wanted to get in on this Alex Schumacher bandwagon? Where can we find you?
I'm on Twitter and Instagram. Both are at AJ Schumacher Art. So both are the same. And my main website is alexschumacherart.com. And I imagine you might put that up on a site somewhere so people know how to spell it because Schumacher can be confusing to some.
All of those links will be in our description, both for the podcast version and our YouTube channel, guys. So look in the descriptions. I can't. Your website is fantastic. You have a lot of the archived works. So if you guys want to look back at some of his earlier works and you guys can catch up on everything, that's the place to go.
Yeah, yeah.
And then your Twitter account, I've really enjoyed. You kind of like tweet little snippets of current, projects you're working on, and it always catches my eye. And I'm like, man, that's a great idea.
Oh, good. Thanks. Yeah, an engagement on social media is so weird. I'm still sort of learning my way around that, but it's an interesting realm for sure.
Yeah, amen. It's a tough one to trek, but it's nowadays it seems like you can't do a business without it, so it's tricky.
No, absolutely, it's a necessary evil.
Yeah. All right, guys. So that's Alex Schumacher. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me on. It was a lot of fun.
All right, guys. Next, we're going to be going into our deep dive on Outer Worlds, the new game coming to you from Obsidian Games.